So I've probably shown this book before, but I wanted to kind of redo the presentation of this book in the style that I've been doing my videos lately. If you're a long time viewer of my channel, you'll notice that I've taken I made a change on how I do a lot of my videos, which is I've done my new idea, which is this unintentional ASMR, where I'm showing you something. I'm doing a straightforward show and tell video. However, it could be viewed as an ASMR video too, but it's not strictly ASMR. I'm not inventing things or doing real role play. If I am doing things like that, I'm gonna identify it as ASMR. Like the other day, I did a role play one where I was talking about Jack the Ripper, and obviously that was not a straightforward video. That was something that was intended to be ASMR. But in this case, I'm doing these videos to show you this object in a straightforward manner, give you my feedback on it, and then if it's relaxing, then that's great. And I'm hoping that it will relax you. I'm hoping that looking at something like this will be something to help you, wind down in the evening, or to listen to while you're at work, at your desk, or whatever. So, but tonight, I wanted to show you, this is by far my favorite Civil War vault book. And these types of books are called vault books because they contain interactive artifacts, for lack of a better word. This is also one of the earliest vault books that came out years and years ago. So I think vault books have kind of peaked, and now you find them in bargain stores a lot. There wasn't a lot of interest in them. I love them myself. I've always thought these were brilliant. But this is definitely my favorite Civil War related one, but one of my favorite ones, period. So when we look at the end papers, we have a great drawing that would have appeared in one of the newspapers at the time, like Harper's Weekly, of a battle. And when you look at this picture, which side do you think, which newspaper, would it be a southern newspaper or northern newspaper? What clues can you glean from this picture? And sometimes you can glean clues, but I would say this appeared in a northern newspaper. Well, the reason for that is the flag is centered, whereas the Confederate flag here is not centered. The flag is battle damaged, like they were charging into battle. The Confederate officer here looks kind of skeevy, kind of menacing, whereas all of the northern troops look brave and determined. See what I mean? You can tell by looking at the picture which side this was on. Okay. This book is showing its age a little bit, and it's there is a little bit of separation going on. It opens with talking about John Brown, and the chapter is called "The Fanatic." It also talks about some of this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was also considered one of the media causes of the Civil War. John Brown is certainly one of the tangible, this spark, I think they called John Brown. So here is a copy of John Brown's own handwriting. What this is a note that he slipped to a prison guard when he was in the Charleston prison after his ill-fated attack on Harper's Ferry. And it says Charleston, and he has the date on it, and 2nd of December 1859. I, John Brown, am now quite certain, and he underlined certain, that the crimes of this guilty land would never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, mainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. What true words. He was absolutely correct, and this was, at this point, by 1859, there were no more Henry Clay compromises that could solve the problems in this country. Simply put, the differences between the North and the South were at a fever pitch, and it wasn't going to be settled but without bloodshed. The next page is the presidents, and we have on the left Abraham Lincoln and his signature stovepipe hat, and on the right we have Jefferson Davis. And when these fold out, there's a drawing of Lincoln, kind of a caricature, and when we fold this one out, there's a drawing of the southern version of Lincoln that's not very flattering. This is the vilification in a southern cartoon showing Lincoln and the devil with Benedict Arnold stirring the pot of treason. So when you saw cartoons like that, you knew there was some real division in this country in 1860. The next, and what I like how these chapters are so simple. I mean, it starts out with John Brown and the president, and now we have the diarist. This is Mary Chestnut. Mary Chestnut, if you watch the Civil War documentary, she's a socialite who lived in Charleston. She witnessed the war from that point of view, from Fort Sumter through the war, and she jotted it down in her diary, and there's a reproduction of diary pages here. She was an eloquent writer. It would be a whole video to go into the things that she wrote about and her thoughts on things from, keep in mind she was from the Confederate point of view, so her thoughts on Jefferson Davis, on General Lee, on the war itself, the causes, the issues, the politics, and everything. So she's considered one of the foremost primary source authorities on the Civil War. You can, if you watch the Civil War documentary, they quote from Mary Chestnut quite a bit in it. The next page is the commanders, and once again, very much like the president's page, we have Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee. And rather than caricatures, we have the achievements done by them. Here is the attack on Fort Donelson that sort of cemented Grant as a commander, and his unconditional surrender letter that he wrote to a former friend who was commanding the fort. And on this side we have General Lee, and he was offered command of the Union forces, and he declined it at the beginning of the war. So this is a picture of the surrender of General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. Now we have a set of pages talking about the soldiers. And here's a recruitment poster. This is like a commemorative coffee mug that they got for enlisting. I imagine in 1861, so many of these soldiers, when they were joining both sides, they thought this was going to be an adventure. They thought this was going to be exciting, glamorous, a way to get some money, a way to see some things. They had no idea what was in store for them. Also, keep in mind that when many of them joined, they didn't realize it was going to be for that many years. They didn't realize that this would last till 1865, and they didn't realize that even when their enlistments were running up, they were still kept and retained in the Army. There's a lot of stuff that, I mean, I'm a veteran. And, I mean, now, I went in on my terms. I wasn't drafted, but there was a draft during the Civil War. A lot of these young men were forced to fight. And it's no picnic. So, it was a miserable existence, and that can't be stressed enough. Now, this 2 pages details the African Americans during the Civil War. This is a piece of propaganda that was created called Drummer Jackson, and it was done, I believe, by Matthew Brady, and it was showing. There was actually a lot of cases like this where they showed this was probably a freed man, a young man who was a free person for one thing, but they dressed him up, and then in two outfits to show how what an improvement it would be for him to be in the army. And this was, as you can see, African Americans served, they fought. However, this status was short lived because after the Civil War ended, African Americans in the military were slowly relegated to menial positions again. And it took until really the Vietnam War before there was the kind of equality again in terms of the military. But they still had segregated units, although they showed that they were more than willing to fight bravely, with a great example being the Battle of Battery Wagner, among other battles. And it kind of a similar example is if you consider that during World War II there was a we're all in this together attitude. And the reason I know about this is I've been listening to a channel that another YouTuber is playing all the radio broadcasts from World War II, and there was so much stuff about let's all do this together. We're on the same team as Russia. We're on the same team as China. We're on the same team as all these people. We're one fighting family. But all that was dropped. See, when the war's done, it's like they're done with the people. And to me, and here's a poster to say men of color, to arms, now or never. This is a great example when you see this of that famous quote that's so true, is the only thing that history teaches us is that we never learn. And how many more times are we going to have to go through things like this? This is the inventors, and this is a great section because it shows the ironclads. This is the Monitor and the Merrimack is one of the centerpieces of this chapter. These are basically early versions of the metal warships that we have in the Navy now. Before this, there were wooden sail ships fighting, but during the Civil War, among many other things, including repeating rifles and machine guns, submarines, air forces, is they invented these metal warships. And this shows you a cross section of it. There was a lot of modern technology. This is the battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, or more accurately, it's the Merrimack against the CSS Virginia. The Monitor was the original name of that vessel. Here we go to the generals. Now, the commanders was one thing. That was Lane Grant. But the generals would be the subordinates to them, who nonetheless were important. For example, William Sherman, James Longstreet, and Phil Sheridan. Okay, Sherman, of course, was right under Grant. He marched through the South, took Atlanta, which was a very strategic battle. Longstreet was under Lee. Was Lee's warhorse. I think Gettysburg was kind of, although he was with Lee all the way through to Appomattox, Gettysburg really kind of broke things. And Sheridan was, along with Sherman, was another very effective commander who really became much more famous during the Plains Indian Wars, and much more notorious. And here is a letter from the front. And this is a letter from Stonewall Jackson, who was one of Lee's most trusted generals. And you can see his handwriting. T.J. Jackson. He was killed at Chancellorsville. Now we have a very interesting chapter called The Spies. And Belle Boyd, Elizabeth Van Loo. Many of the spies Rose Greenhow, for example. Many of the spies were females, and they could go in between lines and get information and take it back. The Confederacy used them to great advantage to get secrets. There was a lot of spying going on in the Civil War. I mean, it's not talked about a lot, but there was a lot. They passed messages in loaves of bread. There were, and Rose Greenhow was one of the most famous ones. Here we have a cipher. This is before the Enigma machine. This is the type of cipher that was used to pass messages. It's a very cool little prop. And next is the nurses. Oh my gosh, field hospitals in the Civil War must have been, pretty horrific. Limbs being cut off, very little in the way of painkillers, no antibiotics. Infection and disease wiped out more people than battlefield wounds. But the nursing corps was made by Clara Barton. She asked for women to be plain, and she had some very strict rules about nursing. But that's when we first get female nurses. Here is a harrowing chapter about the prisoners, and I've been to Andersonville Prison, and the POW museum, and there is some just shocking stuff. But here is a POW's account of a prison camp, military prison, Rock Island, Illinois. And the conditions in places like Andersonville, although there were terrible, Elmira prison in the north too was also very bad. The prisons were generally not good on either side. Well, in terms of enlisted prisons, at least the officers' prisons were much better. The North didn't have as much of a good excuse as the South, because the South was already depleted on resources. So, they could barely feed their soldiers, much less the prisoners. But the North didn't have nearly as good an excuse for the amount of death and disease that plagued the prison camps. There was just no good way to look at either side on that respect. The photographers. This is another really good chapter, and I'm going to warn you before I show you some of these photographs that they're graphic. So, the point of these photographs was to bring the war to everyone's breakfast table in the morning. Matthew Brady, among others, this was the first time that war documented just death and injuries, and with the use of the camera, and I think, if you think about it, many wars past through the Napoleonic Wars and on had this sort of romantic feel, because they were really only discussed in poetry and written accounts. But in the Civil War, we see the awful cost of war, and these photographs are real, and they're very graphic. I find this photograph to be just nightmarish. These are bodies being dug up and reburied. This was the first time that pictures like this were captured. So consider that you're in an existence where seeing things like this are just not seen unless you're actually in a battlefield. So to bring that to the civilians is going to have a big effect on the popularity of wars. Now, with that said, Lincoln was fighting a very uphill battle getting reelected, because the effect of these photographs on the North, seeing these in galleries, seeing this carnage, that was making this a very unpopular war. So he was reelected, but there was a lot of animosity at this point. That's a good segue to the folks at home, the people watching in horror as this war drags on for 5 years and just shows no sign of ending. They're losing loved ones. They're hearing accounts of terrible things. Every year the war gets meaner. That's another thing people have got to understand. There's this romantic idea that was in some cases true in the beginning of the Civil War, with this sort of code of valor and this sort of like, we're passing messages to each other. We don't really hate each other. But by 1864 and 1865, they hated each other. There's no other way to look at it. The Southerners and the Northerners, they hated each other. The troops hated each other. And when there used to be chivalry on the battlefield in the early parts of the war, there was cold-blooded murder happening on the battlefield in the later parts of the war. But here's a copy of a letter, and I actually have some actual Civil War letters that I've shown before that I'll probably show again, that are very similar to these reprints in the respect that they are written on several pieces of paper. But these are great reprints of letters. There's the size of the envelope, the size of the paper. Now I'm gonna do another video and show my letters again, the real ones. But the writing and everything, and that's one reason I love books like this too, because you get these great little artifacts like that. I'm gonna put these back in this cool little envelope. Now we get towards the end, the assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Like the Kennedy assassination, many unanswered questions about this. These are replicas in color of the tickets to Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, and they've been validated. And this is what the tickets would have looked like. So Lincoln was watching the play, and he was, I want to show you something real quick, if I can find it. Well, oh, here it is. Okay. He was shot with a pistol. This is a replica of the Derringer that John Wilkes Booth used to shoot him. It's a small replica. Obviously, it was bigger than this, but this is exactly what the Derringer looked like. The only difference being that it had a trigger guard here. So, Booth shot Lincoln, and he lived until 7 the next morning. And Booth was on the lam for a good little while until he was captured, and very much like John Wilkes Booth, killed before he could be tried. So there was a lot of unanswered questions. The other conspirators were killed. If you want to watch a good movie about it, there's a movie called The Conspirator you might want to consider watching. And we have an afterword. We have some notes in the back. And finally, the end papers show the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And then there's some details about the book. So, It shows you the different little artifacts. And this is the author, Chuck Wallace. So this is one of my favorite books. It's simple, but it's a great artifact book. It's a great vault book, and it gives you some of the basic history, and it just in bullets, just in bullet points. So it's a good one to have. I've studied the Civil War since I was 12 years old, so I know a lot about it. But if you're new, if you want to get to know about the Civil War, a book like this is a good start. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks so much for visiting, watching. If you haven't done so already, I'd love it if you subscribed and gave me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to leave a comment, I like to answer them. I am a little slow about answering them all, but I will get around to it. So thank you so much, and I'll see you again. Bye.